Hey readers, Chris here, and today we're going to be reviewing the entirety of The Wheel of Time. If that sounds like a tall task, that's because it is. Each book in the series builds upon previous installments. Sometimes a singular book is mediocre out of context, but answers questions in unique and interesting ways. This makes it difficult to establish criteria applicable to new readers, while remaining honest about all of the odd little quirks that a series this size inevitably possesses. This quandary has led me to a single conclusion. I can't review each book individually. The entire story has to be taken into account in order to give the correct impression to readers. This compromise does mean that some things will be lost in translation. Without the focus on a singular book, some of the good and bad will inevitably be glossed over. Some books begin and end with flourish. Some trudge along at a snail's pace and never feel fulfilling. We simply do not have time to nitpick all of these things. As always, I will never tell you whether a book or series is worth your time. That decision is yours. And I won't put a number or letter grade in any of my reviews. I will, however, conclude with my personal opinion as succinctly as possible. With that out of the way, let's jump into my review of The Wheel of Time. The opening sequence in Eye of the World is iconic. Even if you've never read the series, I guarantee that you've seen the influence it's had on modern fantasy. It inspired writers for 2 decades and set the bar for how to do a prologue correctly. I'm not usually a fan of prologues. They put you into a scene, establish characters, and then throw them away almost immediately in favor of the true cast. The Wheel of Time is guilty of this exact sin, but it does such a wonderful job of tying the opening into the story as a whole that it can be forgiven, especially upon rereads. It's the kind of chapter that gains meaning the deeper into the series you go. The writing style and pacing are a snapshot of what to expect with the rest of the story, and I have to say, if you don't appreciate what Robert Jordan has brought to the table in the first few pages, you likely won't enjoy the rest of the series. The follow-up to this amazing prologue is another stellar sequence that defined fantasy for years. If you have read modern fantasy, you have seen the influence this had, particularly in those high fantasy epics. This does create a problem, however. It's not aged well. It reads well, and it's immersive. But because so many tales begin in a similar manner, it can feel like a retread, despite the fact that the trend started with this series. If you can get past that vaguely familiar feeling, Robert Jordan will get his hooks into you, and it will be difficult to put the book down. The following chapters slow things down significantly. That's not necessarily a bad thing, particularly if you're a fan of copious world building. Jordan weaves a beautiful world throughout the whole series, and the first chapters are a masterclass in setting up your world for the future. Everything from the characters to the village they inhabit spring to life, and they feel truly alive. Jordan had a very unique voice when he began writing The Wheel of Time. His blend of syntax, word choice, and pacing set him apart from contemporaries like Martin, making for a fun and easy read that creates complexity with density. It's beautiful in its own way, but more importantly, it was perfect for what he was building. Once again, we see the influence he had on modern fantasy. Many writers have adopted and adapted his writing style to their own voice. Sanderson, Brooks, and Weeks are perfect examples. And if you've ever read one of their books, you'll find yourself in familiar territory with Jordan. One common complaint about Robert Jordan's stylistic decisions is how certain descriptions can drag on for what feels like pages. And unfortunately, this is true. It's easy to get bogged down in the sheer detail, and more than once during my many read-throughs, I've had to stop and reread something to connect the dots. Getting lost in that detail is part of the experience, and while it might take some time to appreciate, you may actually fall in love with how Jordan weaves the world around you, even if you lose the trail of action occasionally. Pacing is considered Jordan's greatest weakness. In the micro sense, he struggled to keep on track because of his love of world building. It feels like he gets lost himself fairly often, and leads readers into tangents that don't do much for the story as a whole. On the macro scale, there are several plot points throughout the books that feel like filler content. In a couple of cases, it's not scenes or chapters that bring little revelatory content to the party, but entire books that are devoid of meaningful plot. Some would say that is an unfair criticism, that the books that I am referring to were important in their own way. But I would counter that much of what is covered in these middle books could have been reduced to mere chapters in another novel, instead of stretched out so far. Don't be confused. The prose never falters. The characters are still wonderful, but the narrative grinds to a halt more frequently and for longer than it should. Even during these difficult reads, the characters still shine through, in large part because of how well Robert Jordan built and grew them. That was, in fact, one of the things many people laud Robert Jordan for, his characters. While there are undoubtedly flaws, particularly when dealing with male and female interactions, overall, the characters feel well fleshed out and real. The intention with which Robert Jordan crafted his characters is on full display from the very beginning. Each one has their own will, their own motivations and thoughts that drive their actions organically. There are deserved criticisms of the way men and women interact, up to and including the way romances develop, or fail to develop. There are several times throughout the series when two people who are magnificent characters on their own interact, and both are made lesser because of it. This criticism comes with one massive caveat, however. The best moments in the series are when willful characters come together and we get to witness a spectacular scene. The Wheel of Time as a whole contains the best character arcs that I have ever read in fantasy, period. Watching characters grow and progress is one of the things that I personally love about the fantasy genre, and Robert Jordan mastered this craft from beginning to end in The Wheel of Time. Unfortunately, his love for characters comes back to haunt readers as the story progresses. The sheer number of moving parts, and the truly epic amount of characters, adds a level of complexity and inaccessibility that many readers will find difficult to overcome, particularly if you are consuming the books in an audio format. Jordan had a penchant for adding characters late into the story, for reusing names, and for utilizing character point of views only a handful of times. This created a broad spectrum of deep, fully motivated characters with which to learn and grow, but it also leads to great confusion unless you are meticulous in keeping track of every plot line. It becomes even more complicated whenever you add in the layers of world building Jordan did on top of his characters. If you are a fan of deep, rich, complex worlds full of equally deep characters, you will almost certainly enjoy The Wheel of Time. Sadly, many will likely struggle with the dense sections of world building, unbroken by dialogue or action, that detail everything from servant liveries to house flags to ancient histories. All of that said, there are few fantasy worlds that rival The Wheel of Time in terms of scope, and truly avid readers can lose themselves in the world for months without stumbling across every piece of information. The themes in The Wheel of Time are so interlaced with the story itself that it's almost impossible to see them without taking a step back. Unlike a lot of fiction, Jordan did not pummel you with morals or even answers to difficult questions. Instead, he often posed a question and found the equilibrium between two differing answers. He did a magnificent job of striking the balance between objective truth and subjective feeling, and the diverse cast of characters wrestle with difficult moral questions in very different ways. A princess will see the world quite differently than a shepherd, but it is when Jordan crosses socio-economic barriers that the motifs become truly deep. While the struggle between objective good and evil is center stage for the entirety of the story, we also see characters struggle with sanity, love, loss, purpose, and responsibility. On top of those relatively simple themes are layered deep philosophical questions. Does a predetermined fate rob you of free will? What happens when your mind is not your own? Is death sometimes the easy way out? Is it morally wrong to go against your nature? And many, many more. Each character struggles with some subset of these, and they all come to different conclusions in different ways. I know that this is a lot, and I know that it barely scratches the surface of a 15-book epic series. So I want to give you some time to consider everything that I have said, sans my personal opinion on the series. Sit back, think it over. Does this sound like something that you want to invest your time in? Here is my opinion, as simply as possible. The Wheel of Time is a magnificent series, full stop. It has issues, some of which might be deal breakers to some readers, but the writing style, voice, characters, world building, and themes are rarely matched in literature, regardless of genre. That's all from me today, folks. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Bratton Reviews. Please hit like and subscribe if you want more content like this, and I will see you next time.